It's such a nice day out. Beautiful. We're gonna go outside today for sure. Oh, so not a vlogger, but I'm trying.
The need to know gritty details of how do you become a full-time YouTube entrepreneur. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but let's get into attribute number 1. SEO was the top tactic. I got my power supply from there as well in that bag. SEO is the top tactic.
Okay, let's go outside for a bit and I'll start this vlog. Come sit out with me on my deck. Oh, hi friends, welcome to my vlog. I am creating this for my channel just because it's World Mental Health Day and I wanted to start just doing vlogging in general, and I thought it'd be a great day to kind of, for you to get to know me and for me to kind of share my experience with mental health. And I'm just gonna start with kind of talking about where I have come from and my background and just how I ended up being here on YouTube and why I'm doing this. And yeah, so follow along. So how I found out my mom had bipolar. It's kind of a long story and I don't really know how to tackle it, but it was an accumulation of things. We had been homeless a few times, and it was me kind of putting together the things at about 13 years old. My mom had been involved in a lot of abusive relationships, and I'd kind of observed the highs and lows, and I obviously didn't know what bipolar was, but I knew there was something wrong with my mom. I knew that I couldn't trust her, and that was extremely scary at that time. And not being able to trust a parent when they're supposed to be the one taking care of you was a big theme in my life throughout my childhood. And I'm gonna give you guys some examples of what happened to me to kind of guide me to figuring out that my mom had this mental illness. Okay, so I'm gonna continue to tell the story. It was just Toonie's birthday yesterday, so I still have my happy birthday sign up for her. I'm gonna sit here the whole day. We're gonna go out. I'm gonna walk this little dog, and I'm gonna tell you a few of the stories that led me to how I am here today. You ready to go, James? You ready to go? Should we do it? Let's go. This is what I have to deal with every day. Come on, let's go. So one of my biggest education points for mental health with people is that if someone is acting erratic or not normal, there's probably something going on for them mental health wise. This can be anything from acting out of character. It can be purchasing a lot of items that they don't have money for. This can be acting paranoid. There's so many examples, and I encourage you to look it up and get educated about it because it is such a relevant topic and it is something that permeates our entire culture. And those of us that just feel like it doesn't touch us, guaranteed you will be touched by somebody that has a mental health issue at some point during your life. And that's one of the reasons it's so important for me to tell my story is that sometimes it's the people you don't even know that have been touched by it. And I think that sometimes by us sharing stories, it empowers others to share their stories, and then we become stronger as a whole community in terms of dealing with these kind of situations with sympathy versus just an aversion. Okay, so before I talk about anything specific to do with me, I want to talk a little bit just generally about what bipolar is. So bipolar is a mood disorder, to put it really simply. So you know how we all have like good days, bad days. This is a more extreme version of that that occurs. It's almost hard to diagnose in some people because it almost comes across as a personality disorder. And I don't know if they've ever really figured out exactly what my mom's diagnosis is, because I know she has periods of psychosis also. So she has just a lot of paranoia along with her bipolar when she's having a manic episode. So to put it in simple terms, bipolar is a mental illness that people have where there is periods of mania. So a manic episode, from my experience with my mom, was her talking more rapidly, having less fear over things that normally you would be more cautious of. So putting herself in, and us as children, in dangerous situations. Just a general feeling of anything is possible. So I'll explain in a second one of those examples, but really feeling like the world is her oyster and that the world revolves around her and just nothing bad can happen to her. A period of depression, for me, at least with my mom, these were shorter periods, and it was more her kind of crawling into a dark hole. And honestly, like, one thing I've really recently learned about trauma, which is really interesting, and it's kind of hard sometimes for me to think of distinct examples of my childhood, of things that happened, because I realized when you're in a traumatic experience, from what I've just recently read, that your Broca's center in your brain actually kind of, your ability to talk about that experience is more limited, just because you are in a traumatic experience. So you're not really able to like think about how that trauma was affecting you and reiterate it later on. So I'm going to talk about some distinct examples, but a lot of the examples in my childhood, I literally feel like I was just coping and I was trying to manage my mom, and it was so fear-based in the time, and I was so uncomfortable with what was going on that I actually think like that I've blocked a lot of it out. And I'm sure anyone that has grown up with a parent with something similar to this, it is very traumatic. And for me, at least, being the eldest child, it was really hard for me to navigate my childhood with my mom in her manic episodes.
We're gonna go for a walk? Okay, let's go. Let's go. Get up.
I'm trying to vlog down here, but it's a little too windy, so I'm just going to do the walk, and then I'll come back to the story in a second. Hi, Jules! Okay, so where to start with this whole my mom having bipolar story? One of the things I really noticed as a child was my mom was hit or miss. She had periods where she would be really fun, and we would do things like paint rainbows on our car and dance around the living room and bake cookies and all normal kind of mom stuff, but there was also really scary times where there was things that she did that didn't make sense. So she would be really late for appointments or act really erratically or take us out for dinner and not have money to pay for it, and then act like it was the restaurant's fault. And sorry, it's really windy. And wait for it to pass. As I got older, it started to get more embarrassing and more noticeable. And my biggest example of a manic episode that I went through with my mom as a child is her taking us to Disneyland with no money. And what I mean by that is that she had gone through a period of what I think now is paranoia, where she had bought coins of silver and gold that were worth money, and she thought the paper money was going to go extinct. And one day she got home and she told us to put all of our clothes into garbage bags. We didn't have suitcases because we didn't travel. We didn't have any money to travel. And so we threw all our clothes in garbage bags and we started driving. We drove across the border. And I remember just thinking, I must have been like 9 or 10, just that I was scared. Like, because of the way she was behaving, there was no real reason for us to be doing this. And she didn't stop for a long time. She just kept driving and driving and driving. And we had an ice cream bucket in the back where we could go to the bathroom because she wasn't stopping. And so we had to stop along the way because we didn't have money to pawn these coins. And that was always interesting because we were not getting what they were worth, and it was a whole thing. And then we would use the money to buy propane for the car, to buy accommodation. And we finally got to Disneyland and we had a pretty good time. But again, like, we didn't have much money to spend, so it was kind of just a weird trip when you know that it's not supposed to be stressful to go to Disneyland. And the way back got even more scary because we really ran out of money at that point, and because our car ran on propane, it was one of those things that you couldn't get propane everywhere. So there was many times where we would be in the night and we would be almost running out of propane, and we had to stop at police stations. We had to get help. And just as a child, this was really concerning. It was probably my first time being the eldest of the family where I kind of started to realize maybe I hadn't had to put myself in a parent role. And it was really scary because I obviously was quite young to have to do that. And I just started to realize that I couldn't trust my mom. So that was kind of the first time that I realized something was wrong with my mom, but I didn't obviously know what bipolar was or how to define it, or even who to ask for help or what I was going to do about it. So we got home safe, and shortly after that, we ended up moving in with my mom's boyfriend at the time. And I just remember him being really abusive, and we were homeschooled, so I was home a lot to observe kind of what was happening, and it was scary at times because we had to call the police. Okay, so I'm losing battery, so I'm going to go home and then I will finish the story because there's a major part to the whole thing where it got really confusing. Okay, so we're living with my mom's abusive boyfriend, and there was several times where we had to call the police, and he would leave for a while and then he would end up back at the house, and many stories along that line, but that doesn't tie in with how we got to me really figuring out my mom had bipolar. So I got woken up in the middle of the night and my mom's hand is bleeding and she has a bag over her hand, and it's scary, obviously, but this has happened before, so I didn't really know what was happening, but I was like, and she was like, grab your stuff, we're leaving. And so in the middle of the night, we packed all of our things into our Suburban that we could pack, and we got on the first ferry back to Vancouver. We were living on the Sunshine Coast, and at that time, I didn't know we weren't going to be going back to our house, and so we took whatever we could in the car, and when we got to Vancouver, we ended up finding a transition house to stay at for women who need a safe place to be with children. And so we stayed there, and we had our pets with us, so it's just, the whole thing was so crazy. And you can only stay in a transition house for a month, so we ended up having to move out of the transition house after a month because we hadn't found a place to stay that was within our budget. So we ended up having to move into a campground, and we were homeless. This is actually the second time we had been homeless since I had been 9, I think was the first time. It all blurs together. And so we lived in this campground for a month in a tent, and I was 13 years old at this time, and it was so embarrassing for me. At this time, I think she was manic. I don't even know anymore, but she would make us take everything out of the tent every day and air it out and then put it all back in. And it was a whole production. It was just embarrassing. At one point, we ended up having a hockey team that was all my age beside me. And at 13, I was devastated to be living here. Hey, Toonie, she's just right here. To be living in a tent beside these guys who were just on a hockey tournament. It was just so embarrassing. But as a side note, we finally found a place to stay. I had started a babysitting business at that time. So I was babysitting a lot of the kids in the neighborhood, and there was this one family I used to babysit for all the time. And one night I was supposed to babysit for them, and my mom was just acting really erratic, and there was lots of things going on. Like, she was flooding the bathtub and she was flooding the sinks, and she would forget things, and it's really hard to describe it unless you've lived it, but it was just this state of paranoia that I just started to realize that she was, I don't even know how to describe it, just off. So she drops me off for babysitting, and 10 minutes later comes back in and starts talking to the father of the 2 children, saying that he's not allowed to drive me home. She was obviously very paranoid about something happening between me and him. And anyways, she's acting erratically. I'm still to this day surprised that these people left me alone with their children at that point. So I babysit the kids. I'm a little thrown off. My mom had left. She took my brother and sister with her. And I get home. The mom drives me home at the end of the night, and there's nobody home. And so she drops me off. She didn't know. And I walk in, it's like 11 o'clock at night, and no one's home. And I remember just being really scared and thrown off by the whole thing, because I had school the next day. And it was actually the first year I had been in school, because I had been homeschooled until this year. So it was like in May, and I almost made it through my first year of real school. So yeah, then that happened. Basically, she gets home and she says to me, "How much money did you make tonight?" And I had made like $40, and she was like, "Okay, well, great. Bring it with us because we're leaving." And this leaving theme just triggered me, because the Disneyland thing, we had been leaving. We had finally found a place to live after being homeless for months, and I just couldn't handle it. And I remember just saying to her, no, I'm not going. And it was the first time I had stood up to her in my entire life. And she had been quite controlling over my whole life, obviously, because she thought she's right, or she thinks she's right, and it's a product of her mental illness. But she just turned to me and she said, okay, well, the rent's due at the end of the month, and good luck. And she stormed out, and I sat there and cried. And then the following day, I got ready for school, and I went to school, and I called my aunt and told her what had happened. And she lived far away, so she called my grandpa, and then she called my dad, who I barely knew. And through a series of events, it turned out that I ended up going to live with him. And that's the start of telling the story, of me figuring out this whole bipolar piece. The reason I'm starting to share this story with you guys is because mental health is so permeable in our society. It's everywhere. And if you're living with somebody whose behavior is consistently erratic and you're finding it hard to navigate and stand up for yourself within that behavior, I just am trying to tell you my story from my perspective and the things that I went through and how I kind of figured it out. And it's terrifying, because it's terrifying to realize that a parent isn't a safe person for you. And it's been a hard journey for me to come to acceptance with my mom. But basically from a very young age, I had to parent her, and I didn't get that parenting that I needed. And from what I've read, this is a really common theme with people that have bipolar. So if you're someone that this story resonates with you, I would love to hear your story, and I'd love for you to comment below, because I sympathize, and it's a journey that no one should have to go on. But I hope you guys have a good rest of the day, and that was my first vlog. So I hope you guys have a good rest of the day, and that was my first vlog. So I did it.